Welcome to the Heartbreak Stories channel. Let's go for a walk and listen to a new story about a man who came home at the wrong moment and heard the truth he was never supposed to hear. He had a choice, fall apart or fight back. Now let's listen.
I came home early one afternoon and heard my wife say something she never meant for me to hear. I walked out without a word and said nothing. What I discovered over the next few days was so calculated, so deliberate, that I still have trouble believing how close I came to losing everything. And I mean everything. My name is Dorian Brewster. I'm 46 years old. I work in commercial HVAC installation, been doing it for 22 years. I'm not the kind of man who talks much about feelings. Never have been. I wake up early, I do the work, I come home. That was the deal I made with myself when I was young. And for most of my life, it held together just fine. Jolene and I met when I was 27. She was 24, working the front desk at a physical therapy clinic in Columbus, Ohio. She had this way of laughing that made her room feel warmer. We got married 2 years later, bought a house in Westerville, and built what I thought was a solid life. No kids, that didn't happen for us, and after a while we stopped chasing it. We had the house, the dog, the routines. We had each other, or so I believed. Looking back now, I can see the signs I missed. The long evenings she spent on her laptop with the screen tilted away from me. The weekend team-building retreats at her marketing firm that seemed to happen more and more often. The way she stopped reaching for my hand at the movies. I noticed each of these things separately, but I never stacked them up. Maybe I didn't want to. Maybe I was just too tired from a long week of crawling through ductwork to ask the right questions. A man can build walls around his blind spots without ever picking up a single brick. The day everything changed started the way 100 other days had. I was halfway through service call at a strip mall on the north side when the supply house called. The part one needed wouldn't arrive until Thursday. Job done for the day, 2 hours early. I texted Jolene. No reply. Figured she was in a meeting. I stopped at the hardware store, grabbed a box of wire anchors I'd been meaning to pick up for a month, and drove home. I pulled into the driveway at 3:47 p.m. Her car was already there. I remember thinking she must have left early too. I came in through the side door off the garage, the one that opens into the laundry room, and I was shaking the dust off my jacket when I heard her voice carrying from the kitchen. She wasn't on a call. She was talking to someone in person. A man's voice, low and easy, answered her from somewhere near the island. I froze. He has no idea, Jolene said, and she wasn't whispering. She was relaxed, comfortable. Dorian's not the kind of man who looks too closely at anything. He just trusts. It's almost sad, honestly. The man laughed, a short, confident sound that told me he'd heard this kind of thing before. You don't feel anything for him anymore. There was a pause, not a hesitant one, a considering one, like she was deciding whether the question was even worth answering. I stopped feeling anything for Dorian a long time ago, she replied flatly. He's just furniture, and I hate him at this point. Useful furniture, but still. I stood in the laundry room with my jacket half on, and the world went very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that lands on you after something explodes. I did not move for what felt like several minutes. My boot was still untied from when I'd loosened it getting out of the truck. I looked down at it, focused on the lace, breathed. Then I turned around, stepped back outside, and pulled the door shut behind me without a sound. I sat in my truck in the driveway for a moment. I could see the kitchen window from where I was parked. Their silhouettes moved inside, unhurried, relaxed at home. My home. I started the engine and drove away. I didn't go far. I ended up at a park about 3 miles out, pulled into the empty lot by the baseball diamond, and just sat there with the engine off. Bruno, our German shepherd, wasn't with me. He was inside. That bothered me almost as much as everything else. I replayed her words. Useful furniture. Not broken, not over, not complicated. Furniture. Something you keep because getting rid of it is inconvenient. I didn't cry. I didn't hit the steering wheel. I just sat there and let it sink in the way cold water sinks into a shirt. Slowly, completely, until there's no dry part left. By the time the sun started dropping behind the tree line, I had made one decision. I wasn't going to walk back in there and flip the table. Not yet. Not before I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I drove back an hour later. Her car was gone. The house was quiet. Bruno met me at the door like nothing had happened, tail going like a propeller. I scratched behind his ears, walked to the kitchen, and stood where they had been standing. There were 2 coffee cups in the sink. Not hers and mine. 2 that matched. I washed them both, dried them, put them away. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall and started thinking like a man who just realized he was standing on a trapdoor. I didn't know yet how far down the drop went, but I was about to find out. I slept in my truck that night, drove out to a rest stop on Route 62, reclined the seat as far as it would go, and stared at the ceiling until somewhere around 3 a.m. when exhaustion finally won. Bruno was inside. That kept nagging at me. The dog, alone in the house, probably confused about where I'd gone. But I couldn't go back in there. Not yet. Not without a plan. I woke up stiff and cold with a gas station coffee going lukewarm in the cup holder. The morning was gray, the parking lot empty except for semi-idling at the far end. I sat up, rolled my neck, and felt the previous day settle back on my shoulders like a load of wet concrete. I checked my phone. 3 texts from Jolene. The first said dinner's ready. The second said, where are you? The third said, I'm going to bed. Let me know you're okay. No panique. No urgency. Just mild inconvenience. That told me something. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove to the nearest diner, ordered eggs I barely touched, and was staring at my coffee when my phone buzzed with an email. No subject line. Unknown sender. 1 attachment, and 3 words in the body of the message. You should know. I set the phone face down on the table and finished my coffee first. Not because I was calm, because I needed a minute before I let whatever was in that file into my head. When I opened it, the attachment was a video, 42 seconds long, filmed from across a restaurant. Low light, candles on the table, the kind of place Jolene always said was too pretentious for her taste. And yet there she was, leaning toward a man I didn't recognize, her hand resting easy on his forearm. She was smiling the way she used to smile at me in the early years, unguarded, lit up, fully present. Then the audio came through, muffled at first, then a few words cut clear. He'll never see it coming. That's the thing about Dorian. He always looks straight ahead. I put the phone face down again. The waitress came by, refilled my coffee without asking. I let her. I sat there for a long time. I didn't recognize the man in the video, but I'd remember his face if I saw it again. Sharp jaw, expensive watch, the easy posture of someone who'd never had to worry about a supply order or a busted compressor in the middle of July. He looked like someone who bought things rather than built them. I replied to the email. Who are you? Why are you sending me this? The response came back in under 10 minutes. I work at her firm. I've seen more than you have. This isn't new. If you want a full picture, I'll show you, but not here. My jaw tightened. I typed back, where? Millstone Diner on Broad Street. Tomorrow. Noon. Come by yourself. I paid for my breakfast, left a decent tip, and walked out into the gray morning air. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, hands in my jacket pockets, watching a crow work over something on the asphalt near the dumpster. Patient, methodical, taking what it needed one piece at a time. I understood that crow better than I had an hour ago. That afternoon, I drove past the house twice without stopping. The second time, I saw Jolene's car still in the driveway and a second vehicle parked half a block down, a dark gray SUV I didn't recognize. I didn't stop. I kept moving, circled back to Route 62, and checked into a roadside motel that charged by the week and didn't ask questions. The room smelled like old carpet and pine cleaner. The heater rattled. I sat on the edge of the bed and called Curtis. My older brother answered on the second ring, the way he always does. Curtis is 3 years older and about 10 years more practical than I'll ever be. He was in the middle of something. I could hear tools in the background, but he went quiet the moment he heard my voice. Talk, he said simply. So I did. I told him everything. The kitchen, the words, the video, the email, the meeting tomorrow. I talked for almost 20 minutes without stopping, and Curtis listened without interrupting once, which is unusual for him. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. You back in the house? He asked. No, motel off 62. Good. Stay there tonight. His voice was steady, deliberate. Don't call her. Don't text her. Don't go back until you know what you're walking into. Can you do that? Already doing it, I replied. All right, go to that meeting tomorrow. And Dorian, take notes. Everything they tell you, write it down. Dates, names, amounts. Whatever it is. I told him I would. After I hung up, I sat in the dark motel room with the rattling heater and thought about the man in the video. The easy posture, the expensive watch, the way Jolene had leaned toward him like he was the only source of gravity in the room. I didn't know his name yet, but I would. Millstone Diner on Broad Street was the kind of place that had been there since the 70s and hadn't tried too hard to hide it. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, a coffee pot that never seemed to empty. I got there 15 minutes early, took a booth near the back wall where I could see the door, and ordered coffee I didn't need. She came in at 5 past noon. Early 30s, dark coat, hair pulled back tight. She moved with the kind of controlled purpose that told me she'd thought hard about being here. She spotted me before I could raise a hand, came straight over, and slid into the seat across from me without taking off her coat. Dorian Brewster, she said, not a question. That's right, I replied. And you're Renee Stokes. She kept her voice low. I work in operations at Jolene's firm. Have for 3 years. She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder, setting it on the table between us like she was placing something fragile. I looked at it. Didn't touch it yet. Why are you doing this? I asked, watching her face. Renee pressed her lips together for a moment. Because I know what Dylan Fontaine does to people, she said carefully. He did it to me first, 2 years ago, before he moved on to your wife. He ran the same plays, the charm, the promises, the quiet financial arrangements. By the time I understood what was happening, he'd borrowed $11,000 from me and disappeared for 4 months. She paused. I'm not here out of kindness, Mr. Brewster. I'm here because I know how this ends if nobody says anything. I let that sit. Then I opened the folder. Inside were printed documents, screenshots of emails, expense reports, 2 lease agreements, and a mortgage pre-approval letter. My name was on the lease as co-applicant. My name was on the mortgage as primary borrower. I'd never signed either document, never set foot in the properties listed, never spoken to the real estate agent whose name appeared at the bottom. My hand was steady as I turned the pages. I made sure of that. These signatures, I said quietly, they're not mine. No, Renee confirmed. She submitted everything digitally. Use your tax returns and pay stubs to back the income claims. Fontaine has done this before. He knows which documents to pull and which offices process things fast enough that nobody looks closely. I set the folder down and picked up my coffee. How long? The financial trail goes back about 14 months. That's when Fontaine started appearing in her calendar. Renee slid a printed sheet across the table, a timeline she'd put together herself, neat and dated. He's not a licensed real estate agent anymore. Got flagged for fraud 5 years ago in Tennessee. What he does now is harder to classify. He finds women in stable marriages with clean credit and helps them transition. I stared at the timeline. There was a date 3 months back with a note beside it. Lease amendment. EB signature obtained. Jolene had handed me a document on a Tuesday evening when I was heading out to a neighbor's retirement cookout. Said the landlord needed an updated insurance waiver on the rental property we owned on Fremont Street. I signed it at the kitchen counter in about 12 seconds because she was standing there with a pen and I trusted her. 12 seconds. I closed the folder and looked up at Renee. There's a neighbor, I said. Lloyd Morgan. Lives 2 houses down from us. Older man, retired postal worker. He mentioned a few weeks back that he'd seen an unfamiliar car in my driveway a couple of times. Said a man got out and went inside. Renee nodded slowly. If he can describe the vehicle or the man, that's useful, especially if it establishes a pattern of access. He's sharp, I said. Notices everything on that street. Has for 30 years. Talk to him, she advised. Quietly, I tucked the folder under my arm and stood. Renee, is there more? Things you haven't printed yet. She met my eyes. Yes. Can you get it to me the same way? Some of it, she said. There are internal emails I can access through the shared drive. Give me a few days. I thanked her, left cash for the coffee, and walked out into the pale afternoon light. I sat in my truck for a moment before starting it, the folder on the passenger seat, the timeline face up on top. 14 months. property in 2 counties. My name on documents I'd never seen. I pulled out my phone and texted Curtis one word, tonight. He replied in under a minute. Here. Curtis lived 40 minutes north of Westerville in a converted farmhouse he'd spent 8 years fixing up himself. When I pulled into his gravel driveway just after 6, the porch light was already on and his truck was parked with the tailgate down like he'd been waiting. I came in through the back door. He had a dry erase board set up on the kitchen wall already. 3 columns, documents, people, timeline. I almost smiled. Curtis had always been the one who organized things when the world got messy. While I was the kind of man who fixed the problem in front of him, he was the kind who mapped every problem he could see coming. He poured coffee without asking, set it in front of me, and sat down across the table. Show me. I laid the folder out piece by piece. He went through it methodically, reading each page fully before moving to the next, making small notes in the margin of a legal pad. When he got to the mortgage pre-approval, he stopped. This is your digital signature, he said, holding it up. Forged, I replied flatly. She had access to old closing documents from when we refinanced the house in 2019. Same format, same font. Curtis set it down slowly. Dorian, this isn't just infidelity. I know what it is. He tapped the paper. This is fraud. Identity fraud. You understand that means you could be on the hook for any debt attached to these documents if she disappears and leaves them behind. I know, I said again. He studied me for a moment, then nodded, accepting that I'd already done the math. All right, then we move fast. He turned to the dry erase board and uncapped a marker. First, your credit. Everything gets frozen tonight. All 3 bureaus. You do it from your phone while we sit here. He wrote freeze credit at the top of the first column and circled it. Second, I'm calling guy I know. Corporate investigator, works fraud cases for insurance companies. I want to know everything about Dylan Fontaine before that name is 2 days old. I pulled out my phone and started the credit freeze process while Curtis made his call. The conversation was short, professional. He gave the investigator Fontaine's name, the Tennessee fraud flag Renee had mentioned, and the approximate business address from one of the lease documents. When he hung up, he turned back to me. 2 days, maybe 3. That's fine, I said. Then I told him about Lloyd Morgan, about the unfamiliar car in the driveway, the man who'd gone inside. Curtis wrote neighbor, L. Morgan, witness, on the board and drew a box around it. Go see him tomorrow, Curtis said. Face to face. Don't call first. And take notes. We worked for another 2 hours that night, building the timeline on the board, cross-referencing the documents Renee had given me with what I could pull from our joint accounts online. Curtis found something I'd missed. A $4,200 transfer from our shared savings to an account I didn't recognize, made on a Saturday morning 3 weeks earlier when I'd been on a job site. I stared at the number on the screen. She moved fast, Curtis observed. She thought she had time. I replied, and my voice came out quieter than I expected. Not broken, just worn to the edge of something. Curtis looked at me across the table for a moment. You holding up? I picked up the coffee. It had gone cold. Ask me when it's over. He nodded once, the way men do when they decide not to push further. Then he turned back to the board, uncapped his marker, and kept writing. Curtis's investigator came back in 36 hours, not 3 days. His name was Paulson, and he sent a 6-page PDF that Curtis forwarded to me at 7 a.m. on a Thursday morning while I was eating a granola bar in the motel parking lot and watching a maintenance truck idle by the dumpster. I read the whole thing twice before I started the engine. Dylan Fontaine, age 44. Born in Knoxville, Tennessee. Real estate license revoked in 2019 following a fraud complaint filed by a title company in Nashville. 2 civil suits, both settled out of court, both with non-disclosure agreements that kept the details buried. He'd operated under 3 different business names in 4 states over the past 7 years. None of them active for more than 18 months before going dark. The current LLC he was running in Ohio had been registered 8 months ago. Same playbook, new state. But it was the last page that put a cold feeling in my chest that I couldn't shake loose all day. Paulson had pulled the public records on our home insurance policy, specifically an amendment filed 6 weeks ago. The primary beneficiary on the life insurance rider attached to the homeowner's policy had been changed. The original beneficiary was listed as Curtis, as we'd agreed years ago when Jolene and I had no children to name. The new beneficiary was a holding company called Brightline Property Solutions, LLC, registered in Delaware. Sole member, Dylan Fontaine. I sat with that for a long time. I called Curtis from the parking lot. He answered fast, which meant he'd already read the PDF. "You saw the last page," I said. "I saw it," Curtis replied, his voice tight. "She changed the beneficiary on the life insurance rider. 6 weeks ago." "I know." A pause. "Dorian, that line Renee told you about. By July he'll be gone, one way or another. You need to hear that differently now." I already was. "It's probably still about the financial erasure," Curtis said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Fontaine needs the insurance angle as a fallback. If you're buried in debt and your name is on enough fraudulent documents, a payout becomes a cleaner exit." I finished. "Right."
I have to stop here for a second, because while this man was quietly walking away, trying to hold himself together, she was already changing the beneficiary on his life insurance policy to her boyfriend's company. I don't have words for that kind of cold calculation. I genuinely don't.
Another pause. "Either way, we document it. We report the unauthorized policy change to the insurance company today. I'll have Paulson file a formal notification." I agreed. Then my phone buzzed with a second notification, an email from the IRS. A notice of discrepancy on a preliminary tax filing submitted under my Social Security number. The filing listed an address I'd never lived at and a business income I'd never earned. The preliminary return had been submitted 6 weeks ago, the same week the insurance beneficiary was changed. 6 weeks ago, someone had been very busy. I forwarded everything to Curtis, then drove to Lloyd Morgan's house. Lloyd was in his front yard when I pulled up, deadheading the rose bushes along his fence line. The man had kept that yard immaculate for as long as I'd known him. He was 68, retired after 31 years, carrying mail on our street and the 4 blocks surrounding it. He knew every car, every routine, every face that didn't belong. He looked up when I came through the gate, read something in my expression, and set his clippers down without being asked. "Come sit," he said, nodding toward the porch. We sat in his wooden chairs, and I told him, carefully, without the full picture, that I was dealing with a situation involving someone who had been coming to my house without my knowledge, and that I needed to know what he'd seen. Lloyd didn't need much prompting. He described the vehicle immediately. A dark gray Audi sedan, newer model, partial plates starting with the letters KD. He'd seen it in my driveway on 4 separate occasions over the past 3 months, always on a weekday afternoon between noon and 4. The driver was a man, tall, dark coat, the kind who walked like he owned whatever surface he was standing on. Once, Lloyd had been collecting his mail when the man came out of my front door and they'd made brief eye contact. The man had nodded like a neighbor and kept walking. "I thought maybe you'd hired a contractor," Lloyd said carefully, "for the addition you mentioned last spring." "No contractó y rápida." Lloyd was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and put a firm hand briefly on my forearm. "I'll write it all down tonight. Dates, times, everything I can remember. You say the word, and I'll put my name on whatever document you need." I thanked him. I meant it more than I could say out loud. Driving back to the motel, I thought about the insurance policy, about the tax filing, about the phrase "one way or another." A man could spend a lot of energy deciding how afraid to be. I decided I wasn't going to spend any. Fear was a weight I couldn't afford right now. What I could afford was clarity, and I was getting sharper by the hour. Bruno disappeared on a Friday. I'd driven to the house mid-morning to pick up some tools I needed for a side job I was keeping up to maintain routine. The last thing I wanted was Jolene suspecting I was building a case. I still had my key. I came in through the side door, grabbed the toolbox from the garage, and called for Bruno. Nothing. I walked through the house. His bed was empty. His food bowl was full, which meant it hadn't been touched since it was filled, probably that morning. His leash was gone from the hook by the side door. I checked the backyard. The gate was standing open about 8 inches. I stood in the yard for a long moment, looking at that gate. It didn't blow open on its own. The latch was stiff enough that Bruno couldn't nudge it. Someone had left it open deliberately or in a hurry and not come back to close it. I walked the neighborhood for an hour, called his name until my throat was dry. Nothing. I drove the surrounding streets in a slow grid, windows down. No Bruno. I left my number with 3 neighbors and posted in the neighborhood app before I even got back to the motel. Then I sat on the edge of the motel bed and stared at the floor. That dog had slept at my feet for 7 years. He'd been in the truck with me on 100 job sites. He'd been the one warm, uncomplicated thing in a house that had turned cold. My jaw tightened. I made a call. "Jolene," I said when she answered, and I kept my voice completely flat, the way you do when you're working hard not to show the wire. "Bruno's gone." The gate was open. "Oh no," she said, and she made it sound like concern, almost convincing. "I must have left it unlatched when I took him out this morning. I'm so sorry, Dorian." She didn't offer to help look. I hung up and went back out. 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was the Hendersons 4 blocks north, retired couple, always out walking. They'd found Bruno sniffing around their back fence and recognized him from the neighborhood app. I drove there in 10 minutes, and when I opened the truck door, Bruno launched himself at me like he'd been searching just as hard from his end. I drove him straight to Curtis's house. He wasn't going back. The second thing that hit me that week came from a different direction. My friend Paul, we'd worked together on a commercial job 3 years back, stayed in occasional contact, sent me an awkward text on Sunday afternoon. "Hey man, heard you've been having some trouble at home. Just wanted to check in. Jolene mentioned you've been stressed and kind of checked out lately. You okay?" I read that message 4 times. Jolene had been working the room. She was already building her narrative, the distant, unreliable husband who'd emotionally abandoned her, setting the stage so that when the collapse came, witnesses would nod and say they'd seen it coming. I called Paul back directly. Didn't text, called. "What exactly did she tell you?" I asked. Paul hesitated. "Just that you've been distant, disappearing for days without explanation. That she was worried about you." "Paul," I said evenly, "I need you to hear me clearly. I'm not going to go into detail right now, but what you're being told is a version of events that was constructed deliberately. When this is over, I'll sit down with you and walk through all of it. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep what I'm telling you in mind before you form any opinions." There was a long pause. Then Paul said, "Understood." That was enough for now. I drove back to the motel with Bruno curled up on the passenger seat, his head on my thigh the whole way. I kept one hand on the wheel and one hand on the back of his neck. Some people show you who they are by the lies they tell. Others show you by who they try to recruit to tell those lies for them. Jolene had just shown me both. Curtis had a contact at a title company who owed him a favor, the kind of favor that gets returned quietly and without paperwork. Through him, we confirmed that the property in Cleveland that Jolene and Fontaine had been building toward was scheduled to close in 11 days. 11 days. The mortgage pre-approval was still active. My name was still on it. If we didn't move before that date, the transaction would record with my digital signature on the deed, and I'd be legally attached to a property I'd never seen, financed through income documentation I'd never provided. We were not going to let that happen. But before we touched the legal machinery, Curtis wanted one more piece. Something with her voice on it. Something that would put her knowledge of the scheme beyond any reasonable doubt. Renee made the call. She reached out to Jolene on a Tuesday morning under the pretext of needing guidance on a vendor contract. A routine enough request, given Renee's role in operations. They met in the small conference room on the second floor of the firm, which Renee knew had a faulty ceiling speaker that the IT department had been ignoring for months. She wore a small digital recorder in the breast pocket of her blazer, the kind that picks up a room conversation clearly at 6 feet. Curtis and I sat in his truck in a parking garage 3 blocks away and waited. Renee was in there for 41 minutes. When she came out and got in her own car, she texted one word: good. That evening, the 3 of us sat at Curtis's kitchen table and listened to the recording on his laptop with the volume turned up. Most of it was professional, vendor terms, approval chains, the mundane scaffolding of a working day. But then Renee steered the conversation with a casual comment about how stressful it must be juggling everything, and Jolene's voice shifted. Relaxed, confident, the way people talk when they think they're among allies. Honestly, the hardest part is the waiting, Jolene said on the recording, her voice clear and unhurried. Everything's almost in place. Dorian's name is on the Cleveland property, the insurance is sorted, and once we get the tax situation finalized, there's nothing left to untangle. Renee's voice, carefully neutral, and Dorian doesn't know any of it. A pause. Then Jolene, almost lightly. Dorian trusts everything I hand him. I've been handing him things for 19 years. He's never once looked twice. I sat at that table and listened to my wife describe me like a lock she'd learned to pick without effort. Curtis had his arms crossed and his jaw set. He didn't say a word until the recording ended. Then he reached over and closed the laptop. "That's enough," he said quietly. The next morning, I drove to our bank, not the branch we normally used, but the main downtown location, and sat across from a fraud specialist named Gerald Holt, who had the careful manner of a man who'd heard a lot of difficult things and learned not to show it. I laid out the documentation in the order Curtis, and I had organized it. The forged mortgage application, the unauthorized insurance amendment, the fraudulent tax filing, and a printed transcript of the relevant portion of the recording with a timestamp reference. Gerald reviewed everything without interrupting. When he finished, he removed his glasses and set them on the desk. "Mr. Brewster," he said, "there are 2 transfers I need to flag for you immediately." He turned his monitor toward me. "The first is a transfer of $4,200 that cleared 3 weeks ago from your joint savings to an external account. The second is a pending transfer, initiated yesterday, of $22,000 from your joint home equity line. This one is not yet settled. $22,000. I looked at the screen and kept my breathing even. "How long do I have to stop the pending transfer?" I asked. Gerald picked up his phone. "I'm going to make that call right now." He did. The transfer was flagged, then frozen pending investigation. Gerald assured me it would not settle while the fraud review was open. He also placed a hold on any further transactions from both accounts that didn't require in-person verification with valid identification. I shook his hand when I left, walked out into the midday light, stood on the sidewalk for a moment with my hands in my pockets. $22,000. Gone in a day if I'd been 2 hours later. I texted Curtis. Transfer stopped. Bank is opening a fraud review. His reply came back in 30 seconds. Good. Now we let it breathe, and we set up the next move. The next move was the firm. Renee arranged the meeting with the firm's regional director through the standard scheduling system. No flags, no irregularities. She requested a performance and compliance review under the pretense of an internal audit process the firm ran annually. Jolene received the calendar invite the same as everyone else. She confirmed it without a second thought, which told me she still believed she was invisible. She wasn't. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Curtis and I spent the 2 days before it making sure the red folder Renee was going to hand the director was airtight. We printed everything. The expense reports with dual guest hotel receipts, the travel reimbursements tied to inactive project codes, the email threads between Jolene and Fontaine that Renee had pulled from the share drive, and the documented connection between Fontaine's current LLC and 2 prior fraud cases in other states. We added one more item the night before, a summary page that Paulson had drafted, laying out how Fontaine's company appeared in the vendor contact list for the firm under a name that didn't match his license history. He had, at some point in the past 8 months, attempted to pitch consulting services to Jolene's firm using a business alias. Jolene had not disclosed her relationship with the vendor. That alone was a terminable conflict of interest under the firm's own code of conduct. Renee walked into that meeting with the folder under her arm and came out 41 minutes later. She texted me 2 words. She knows. Jolene called me 7 times that afternoon. I watched the phone light up on the passenger seat of my truck and didn't touch it. She sent 2 emails. I read the subject lines. "We need to talk," and "Please, Dorian," and closed the app. That night, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I needed to go back to the house. Not to confront her. Not to retrieve anything critical. I think I needed to stand in the place where it all began and confirm that I was still standing. I went at 11:30. Her car was in the driveway. The porch light was off. I used my key on the side door, the same door I'd come through the afternoon I overheard her in the kitchen. I moved quietly through the mudroom and into the hallway. She was in the kitchen. standing at the counter with a glass of water in her hand, still dressed, like she hadn't been able to bring herself to go to bed. She heard me and turned. We looked at each other across the kitchen. There was no version of Jolene I had ever seen that looked like this. Not angry, not defiant, not even caught. She looked small, like something had been removed from behind her eyes, and what remained was just the outline of the woman I'd married. She opened her mouth once, then closed it. I didn't speak either. I walked to the hall closet, pulled out the fireproof box we kept on the top shelf, birth certificate, old tax returns, the original deed to the house, our marriage certificate, tucked it under my arm, and walked back through the kitchen toward the side door. She found her voice when I was almost past her. Dorian. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I can explain. I stopped, turned, and looked at her one more time. No, irrabulia quietly. You really can't. Then I walked out, pulled the door shut behind me without a sound. The same way I'd left the first time, the day I overheard her say I meant nothing. Except this time, I wasn't leaving because I was broken. I was leaving because I was done. I drove back to Curtis's house, sat in the dark driveway for a minute. Bruno was on the back seat, his head resting on the armrest, watching me with the patient attention that dogs apply to things they don't understand but accept anyway. I reached back and put a hand on his side. Last time I told him. He thumped his tail once against the seat and closed his eyes. 8 days before the Cleveland property was scheduled to close, I made the call. I'd gotten the name of the listing agent from the mortgage pre-approval document, a woman named Carla Hendricks, a mid-sized real estate office in the Cleveland suburbs. I called from my cell, identified myself fully, and told her clearly that I had never agreed to purchase the property in question, had never met with her or anyone at her office, and that the inclusion of my personal information, my income documentation, my credit history, and what appeared to be a digital facsimile of my signature had been done without my knowledge or consent, and was currently the subject of an active fraud investigation with both my bank and local law enforcement. She went quiet for a long moment. Mr. Brewster, she said carefully, I was under the impression that both parties had reviewed and approved all documentation. I understand what you were told, I replied. I'm telling you what's true. I'd suggest you speak with your broker and your legal counsel before this goes any further. She confirmed the file would be placed on immediate hold pending review. The closing was suspended. I sat in my truck outside a coffee shop on the east side of Columbus and let the news settle. Curtis was in the passenger seat. While I put the phone down, he exhaled slowly through his nose, the way he does when something difficult goes the right way. Done, I said. Done, he agreed. But Fontaine wasn't done. That same afternoon, Paulson sent us a notification that Fontaine had registered a new LLC in Pennsylvania, a third entity, moving fast, likely anticipating the Ohio operation was about to collapse. Curtis forwarded the information to the fraud investigator at the Columbus Police Department we'd been working with since filing the identity theft report 10 days earlier. Detective Ray Carver had been building the case methodically, and Fontaine's new registration was exactly the kind of escalating pattern he'd been waiting for. 2 days later, Carver called me directly. We've been in contact with the Tennessee authorities, he said. Fontaine's prior civil settlements had sealed records, but the pattern you've given us has been enough to reopen the inquiry. The Pennsylvania LLC registration is now part of an active multi-state investigation. He paused. Your wife has been notified that she may be called in for questioning. I thanked him and hung up. That evening, Jolene called again. I picked up this time, not because I wanted to, but because I needed her to understand that the window she'd been counting on had closed. Dorian, her voice was strained, controlled, like she was holding something together with both hands. We need to sit down and talk through this rationally. We're past talking, Jolene, I replied. Your name is attached to a fraud investigation, a multi-state one. Whatever you need to say it to the detective assigned to the case or to your attorney. This isn't what it looks like. She started. It looks like exactly what it is. I cut in, my voice steady. You forged my signature on a mortgage application. You changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy to Fontaine's LLC without my consent. You filed a fraudulent tax return under my social security number. And you moved $22,000 out of our joint account. That's not a misunderstanding, Jolene. That's a decision. Several of them. Silence on the line. I'm filing for divorce on Monday, I added. You'll hear from my attorney. I ended the call before she could respond. Curtis was standing in the kitchen doorway. He'd heard every word. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he walked over and refilled my coffee without being asked. That was enough. The divorce was finalized 9 months later. Jolene's attorney attempted 3 different approaches. The first was an argument that the financial activity had been a mutual arrangement I'd tacitly approved. That collapsed the moment Curtis submitted the bank's fraud review findings and the recording Renee had made. The second was a character argument about my emotional unavailability. That collapsed when Lloyd Morgan submitted his written account of Fontaine's visits to the house, dated and signed with the precision of a man who'd spent 3 decades paying attention. The third was a negotiated settlement offer that asked me to drop the fraud referrals in exchange for a clean split of the marital assets. I declined. The court awarded me full ownership of the Westerville house, recovery of the $4,200 that had cleared before the bank freeze, and a judgment against Jolene for legal fees associated with the fraudulent filings. She left the marriage with her personal belongings, her car, and a pending cooperation agreement with the Columbus Police Department that her attorney had negotiated to keep her out of a criminal proceeding, provided she cooperated fully with the case against Fontaine. She cooperated. Dylan Fontaine was indicted on 8 counts across 3 states, Ohio, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania. The multi-state investigation Carver had built using our documentation as the foundation ended with Fontaine in custody before the Pennsylvania LLC had processed its first transaction. His prior civil settlements were unsealed as part of the indictment proceedings. 2 other women from previous schemes were identified. Neither of them had known the other existed. Renee Stokes was quietly promoted within the firm 4 months after the investigation closed. She never asked for recognition, and I never offer it publicly. But I sent her a letter. A real one, handwritten, 2 pages. I told her what her decision had meant. She replied with a card that said simply, "He won't do it to anyone else now. That's what matters." Lloyd Morgan still tends his rose bushes. I still wave from the driveway when I drive past, which I do less often now since I sold the Westerville house 8 months after the divorce and bought a smaller place with a good garage on the edge of town. The kind of place a man can work in on a Saturday morning without answering to anyone. Bruno has taken to the new yard with the enthusiasm of a dog who has never once held a grudge in his life. I still do commercial HVAC, still wake up early, still come home at the end of the day and feel the particular satisfaction of a man who does honest work with his hands. It's not a dramatic life, but it's mine, unencumbered and unforged, every square inch of it. Curtis came over for the 4th of July. We sat on the back porch with cold drinks and watched Bruno chase fireflies through the grass, which he has never once caught and will never stop trying to. At some point, Curtis looked over at me and said, "You're doing all right, brother." I thought about the motel room on Route 62, the paper towels on the kitchen floor that I'd thought about for weeks after, the recording, the frozen wire, the night I walked back into that house for the last time and left without a word. Yeah, I told him, I'm doing all right. And the thing was, I meant it, not as something to say, not as a performance of recovery, but as a plain and accurate description of the man sitting in that chair on that evening, watching his dog chase something he'd never catch in a yard that was entirely his own. Some men fall apart when the ground gives out under them. I get it, there's no shame in that. But I've always been better at finding the load-bearing wall. You locate it, you reinforce it, and you build from there. I found mine. I built from there.
This man never once lost himself. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he just got quiet and got to work. That's what real strength looks like. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.